The fall of two ancient orders and the rise of a new power reshaped the map of a region and the lives of millions in a matter of years. In the middle decades of the 7th century, when the great centers of imperial authority in the East and the West still carried the weight of centuries, a set of campaigns originating from the Arabian Peninsula crossed deserts and rivers to change the political geography of Iran and Egypt forever. This film will reconstruct how mobile forces, adaptive commanders, and fragile empires met on fields and behind walls, and how military victories translated into new administrations and altered societies. We will ask why and how these campaigns succeeded where others had failed, what tactics and logistics made them viable, who the central figures were, and what the immediate human consequences proved to be. If you appreciate long-form, source-driven reconstructions, consider leaving a like. It helps keep this kind of production possible. Imagine a map where borders seem carved in stone. Then picture units moving like currents, circling cities, cutting supply lines, and forcing decisions that had little to do with valor and everything to do with momentum. The central question guiding this narrative is direct. How did forces born in a harsh, mobile environment defeat veteran imperial armies and then turn conquest into governance? Based on chroniclers contemporary to the events and modern archaeological and logistical analysis, we will reconstruct the decisive moments, the mechanics of siege and march, and the administrative choices that turned battlefield success into long-term change. The story begins with the men and the cultures that produce them, and with a handful of leaders whose choices magnified local practices into sweeping historical transformation. Before the conquests, there was a patchwork of societies with distinct military cultures. In the Iranian plateau, the Sasanian state maintained a heavy, hierarchical army built around armored cavalry, fortified cities, and a networked fiscal apparatus. In Egypt, a centuries-old bureaucracy governed granaries, canals, and provincial life under a Roman imperial legacy that emphasized garrisons and fortified centers. In contrast, the Arabian corps produced fighters conditioned by scarcity, mobility, and the logic of raiding. These men moved across open space with camels and light mounts, used small unit tactics, and valued speed, intelligence, and flexibility. The social fabric of the Arabian tribes favored quick consensus and a culture of reciprocity, which translated into military units that could improvise and disperse with minimal administrative friction. The difference in resources and organization was clear. Imperial forces relied on fixed lines of supply and heavy instruments of war, while the newcomers operated with low logistical footprints and rapid operational tempo. Visually, the difference could be described as the contrast between a fortress casting long shadowed walls at dawn and a line of white banners that rose and fell across dunes by sunset. The question for strategists in that era was whether mobility could overcome fortification and whether fluid command structures could outmaneuver systems designed for defense. Attritional conflict. The answer lay partly in tactics, partly in timing, and partly in the ability to exploit fissures within imperial governance. The origin of the expansion was not a single plan, but a series of linked opportunities and innovations that coalesced into sustained campaigns. Early raiding patterns evolved into strategic offensives. Camels and light mounts provided endurance across desert marches, allowing forces to approach objectives from unexpected directions. Scouts and local guides were integrated into operational planning, giving commanders information that heavier imperial corps lacked. Supply by foraging and local requisition reduced dependence on formal wagons, and small, agile detachments could strike enemy flanks, withdraw, and force redeployments that eroded morale. Tactically, the movement deployed a combination of skirmishers, mounted archers, and compact shock detachments. In terrain favorable to maneuver, such as open plains and river margins, these forces could outflank heavier units. In sieges, they leveraged isolation and negotiation as often as direct assault. One technical advantage was the exploitation of night marches and feints to unbalance set-piece defenses, forcing commanders tied to rigid doctrinal responses into reactive postures. Another was the cultivation of local alliances, encouraging tribal and urban groups disaffected with imperial tax burdens to sign protective agreements, pay tribute, or defect. Seen from the perspective of logistics, the new approach blurred the boundaries between raid and conquest, converting episodic predation into the acquisition of revenue bases that sustained further operations. Understanding those procedural adjustments is essential to comprehend how combat success translated into sustainable occupation. The first major theaters where these dynamics played out were in the eastern provinces and the Nile Valley. In the lands of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, a series of set-piece encounters and sieges determined whether the old Eastern Order could hold its ground. A campaign that culminated near a great river crossing became the symbol of the turning point. Commanders on both sides confronted realities of morale, supply, and local politics. The confrontation was not only military in the narrow sense, but also administrative and psychological. Imperial garrisons, used to receiving regular pay and drawn from established elites, could lose cohesion when cut off or when internal court politics disrupted reinforcements. In contrast, the mobile forces derived cohesion from shared conviction and flexible command, allowing them to absorb losses without collapsing structurally. Consider a reconstructed exchange on a night before battle. An experienced imperial officer said to his provincial governor, "We hold the riverbank and the city behind us. We must not yield it." The governor replied, "Our lines are thin. The veterans have been pulled away to the frontier, and the treasury is empty. I do not know whether reinforcements will come." Another voice, a scout, whispered, "The enemy will arrive from the west before dawn. They move like ghosts and are already in our tent's direction." The officer finally said, "Then we must trust the walls and the archers on the parapet. We must force them into a frontal fight." The conversation illustrated the split between doctrine and reality, between the assumption of steady support and the lived uncertainty of the campaign. One of the defining battles of the Eastern Campaign was fought on ground marked by canals and pliable soil, where maneuver and shock collided. The soundscape began with hooves on thawing earth, the creak of leather, the low murmurs of men arranging spears, and the distant cry of commanders. The visual was a mix of dust columns and banners, sunlight glancing off mail, and the odd glint of polished scale armor. Smells of damp earth and the sharp tang of sweat and metal filled the air. Timestamps from chroniclers describe a morning visibility limited by mist, then pierced by a sudden burst of cavalry speed that broke the cohesion of one flank. The defenders attempted to rally behind heavy shields, while missile troops tried to cover a disciplined retreat. Dialogue during the fighting, as reconstructed, had a small unit leader shout, "Hold the line! Stem them at the ditch! The governor is watching!" Another replied, "We cannot hold if they break through. Fall back to the secondary berm and buy time." A sergeant answered, "The archers need space. Give them a 30-step front and they will slow the charge." The exigency of the moment forced tactical improvisation. Reserves were committed piecemeal, local guides led countermarches to cut supply routes, and the battle resolved into a grinding collapse of one side that then rippled across the theater. The human element was essential. Not only did tactics matter, but morale and the will to continue when communication failed were decisive. Parallel to Eastern operations, efforts moved into the Nile Valley. Egypt presented a different set of challenges. The countryside was laced with canals, and the life of the province revolved around the annual flood, grain stores, and a dense urban population. The center of gravity was the control of a few fortified towns and administrative centers rather than the open plains. A campaign into this theater required a different blend of military and diplomatic strategies. Commanders approached cities not only with siege engines, but with offers of protection and agreements that kept local elites and clergy from resisting. The approach to Alexandria, for example, combined blockade, targeted raids on supply lines, and negotiations with merchant guilds anxious about stability and taxes. In one reconstructed exchange inside the walls of a city preparing to negotiate, a leading magistrate said, "Our granaries are full and our merchants fear pillage, but we fear new masters and unknown taxes."
The visiting negotiator responded, "We offer to respect your markets and pay the necessary tribute if you open the gates and pledge loyalty." The magistrate answered, "If we accept, will our positions and property be respected?" The negotiator replied, "You will keep your lives and most of your privileges. Our priority is the grain and order." Such talks reveal the interplay of coercion and consent that characterize the takeovers in urban settings. Siegecraft adapted accordingly. Where field battle
Favored mobility, sieges prioritized isolation and denial. Engineers and local workmen erected lines of circumvallation. Watchers manned trenches and sentries counted the movements on the walls by day and by night. Several sieges hinged on control of water and food. In one extended encirclement, the besiegers used both a blockade of river access and a campaign of selective raids on surrounding farms to starve a city into submission. The sensory details during a siege are stark. The clatter of sappers working at night, the acrid smell of fires set to stores, the distant wail of families forced to send children away, and the metallic ring of small sorties trying to disrupt siege works. Dialogue in these scenes is intimate and tactical. A veteran engineer explained to his commander, "If we undermine this wall, the eastern tower will crumble in 3 undermining points, but we will need a silent night and a diversion to cover our work." The commander answered, "Prepare the diversion then. Let the light cavalry draw their attention, and we will detonate at first light." The engineer nodded. "The men will need extra rations to work through the night. They will be exhausted." These moments underline that siege success was rarely a single heroic breach, but a combination of attrition, technical skill, and psychological pressure. Of the commanders who emerged, several figures played central roles in the 2 theaters. One was a tactician who excelled at rapid maneuver, reconnaissance, and the decisive use of reserves. Another was a diplomat and organizer who converted military gain into administrative control, founding new garrisons and urban centers that would anchor the new rule. To provide psychological texture to the main protagonist, we reconstruct his backstory in depth. He was born in a rough village on the edge of the desert, the son of a trader who crossed wadis and salt flats. In childhood, he learned to ride before he could read, to navigate by stars, and to pack for months without resupply. His early training consisted of raiding parties that tested endurance and judgment, where success depended on stealth and the ability to read people's intentions. The loss of a brother in a skirmish taught him the brutality of campaign life and forged a caution that later moderated his boldness in battle. As a young man, he acted as a courier between tribal elders and urban merchants, learning the languages of negotiation and acquiring a habit of listening carefully before speaking. The death of his father pushed him into leadership, and his rise was propelled by a combination of battlefield acuity and administrative sense. In campaigns, he favored mobility and surprise, but he also understood the need to secure roads, garrisons, and grain supplies. This hybrid skill set allowed him to shift from raider to governor with fewer ruptures than other leaders. His presence in a camp altered the tempo of decisions, as men trusted his judgment on when to press and when to pause. The backstory shows not only formative moments, but also the ethical and experiential layering that shaped his later choices. Secondary characters populated the narrative, and each performed identifiable functions. There was a veteran cavalry commander named Rashid who supervised mounted operations and who once cut through 3 lines of skirmishers to relieve a trapped detachment. There was a logistical officer, Musa, who organized supply by local requisition and who devised a system of mobile supply nodes linked to camel trains. An engineer named Jafar specialized in siegecraft and led mining operations that collapsed towers at crucial moments. A local urban negotiator, Salima, served as liaison between city councils and occupying commanders and preserved merchant privileges in return for guarantees of food delivery. A converted bureaucrat, Bahram, defected from provincial administration and provided lists of tax districts and garrison locations, information that decisively shaped campaign targets. Each of these secondary actors appears in scenes performing recognizable actions that change the course of events, from rallying men under fire to negotiating the surrender of a fortified town.
Their named interventions give texture to the strategic narrative and show how campaigns depended on a web of skills beyond mere swordsmanship. Major moments of tension punctuated the campaigns and deserve detailed reconstruction. One such moment occurred at a river crossing under fire, where a small column attempted to secure a bridge against a larger entrenched force. Mood and physical detail matter. The river hissed cold, mud clung to boot soles, wind carried the smell of fish and reeds, and the sky was leaden with rain. Voices were low beneath the clink of armor. The leader of the column ordered, "Push the pontoon now and hold the center. Do not be tempted to chase them downstream." A lieutenant responded, "We will suffer heavy loss if we cross under their archers. Our men cannot stand in the open." The leader answered, "Then we shall use smoke and timing. We cross in waves and the reserve will cover the rear." A private whispered, "My hands are numb, but I will not let go." The action that followed was a textbook of controlled risk. A small diversion drew enemy archers away. Smoke screens masked forward movement, and the crossing succeeded only when the reserve surged at the critical instant. The result was not a glorious slaughter, but a disciplined, costly advance that broke the enemy's defensive arc and opened the river line. The psychological strain and the need for precise timing made the moment one of the campaign's hinge points. Another tension point was the siege of a provincial capital, where leadership decisions had to balance civilian survival and military necessity. Inside the city, supply lines had been cut, and the wealthy had already fled with portable wealth. Voices inside the council chamber showed the divisions. An imam urged surrender on pragmatic grounds. "Our people are starving, we have children, and the fields are lost. We should save what is left." A young commander of the garrison retorted, "If we surrender, we might be
slaughtered or enslaved. Our honor requires we hold." A merchant added, "We can pay tribute, but we need guarantees in writing and hostages as security." The dissent revealed how decisions were negotiated among social actors and not simply imposed by commanders. The eventual capitulation balanced immunity for civilians, a tax arrangement, and a limited garrison for disorder control. And this arrangement became a template for other cities where similar negotiations took place. The moment underlined that conquest often relied on bargains as much as on force. Tactical and technical descriptions are essential to understand the mechanics that allowed success. The core processes included mobile reconnaissance, decentralized command, selective sieging, and administrative conversion of plunder into revenue. Reconnaissance units operated with a light footprint and communicated via runners and signal fires, creating a continuous stream of tactical intelligence. Decentralized command allowed lower-ranking leaders to seize fleeting opportunities without waiting for centralized orders, a risky but effective method in fluid situations. In sieges, engineers used scaled mining, battering, and psychological operations, such as fake negotiations, to weaken defenders. On the procedural side, the integration of defectors into administrative roles turned captured knowledge into operational advantage. Each of these processes can be described in technical terms. A reconnaissance patrol moved at an average of 60 kilometers per day, carrying 3 days of water and eliding supply by requisition. Siege mining required a team of 30 to 40 sapper laborers and 2 weeks of concentrated, perilous excavation, supported by diversionary sorties. Administratively, newly appointed governors instituted a mixed system of tribute and tax forgiveness to secure local compliance, replacing heavier imperial extraction with lighter, more negotiable levies. As the campaigns progressed, the rhythm of victories and negotiations accelerated. In the Eastern Theater, a chain of field defeats and the fall of a major capital precipitated the collapse of centralized resistance. Imperial centers, already strained by court factions and depleted coffers, could not rebuild their field armies quickly enough or secure the loyalty of border commanders who saw survival in local accommodation. The speed at which provinces negotiated agreements surprised many contemporaries. Cities preferred accommodation that preserved commerce and life over prolonged resistance that often led to destruction. The social calculus of survival favored pragmatic bargains.
In the Nile Valley, the capture of grain stores and control of riverine arteries ensured that even if some cities negotiated honors, the strategic backbone of the country shifted toward the new rulers. The conquerors, for their part, had to make immediate choices about garrisons, taxation, and integration. They established fortified towns at choke points, recruited local auxiliaries, and sometimes retained existing bureaucrats to preserve administrative continuity. These decisions turned ephemeral military advantage into durable presence. Costly moments still occurred. At one decisive fight in the Eastern Theater, a reserve failed to arrive on time because of a misread of signals, and for several hours the main body was on the verge of collapse. The commander moved among units, shouting adjustments, reassigning horsemen, and personally leading a counterattack.
To stabilize the front. Dialogue captures the urgency. An adjutant cried, "The reserve is 2 hours late. The enemy is pushing our center." The commander replied, "Then we will thin the lines here and bring up the cavalry from the flank. Hold your nerve." A private said, "I thought we would break, but his presence steadied us." The counterattack bought time, and the reserve, arriving exhausted, struck a damaged enemy flank and turned retreat into rout. Internal process and individual audacity combined in such episodes to produce outcomes that might otherwise have favored the defenders. Consolidation after conquest required an administrative imagination. New governors faced practical problems: integrating local elites, securing food flow, setting up new tax registers, and preventing banditry. The creation of new garrison towns served multiple functions. They housed troops, controlled trade routes, and acted as centers for judicial and fiscal administration. New urban foundations often followed a pattern. A military camp became a settlement. Craftsmen and merchants were invited or coerced to settle, and quay and market rights were negotiated to stimulate commerce. Examples include the foundation of 3 new towns that served as hubs connecting the lowlands to interior supply regions. Administratively, the conquerors implemented a 2-tier tax system, combining a fixed tribute on urban centers and a scaled land levy. They often left agricultural taxes to be collected by familiar local hands, while taking control of customs and large estate incomes. This hybrid approach reduced resistance and ensured steady revenue. The practical techniques of consolidation included registering landholders, cataloging armaments, and deploying small mobile patrols to deter raiding and enforce order. These measures reveal that military takeover was only the first step. Institutional measures were necessary to convert victory into governance. Across months, the social effects emerged. In urban centers, local elites negotiated their status in exchange for cooperation. Merchants accepted security guarantees that maintained long-distance trade, and rural populations adjusted to new tax rhythms. In religious terms, conversions occurred unevenly and slowly. In many places, pragmatic arrangements with local religious leaders preserved ritual life in return for political compliance. The demographic impact of warfare produced both population movement and the creation of new urban constituencies aligned with the new rulers. Such realignments had long-term implications for resource allocation and political loyalty. The collapse of one imperial order produced a vacuum that the conquerors filled not only with troops, but with legal codes, taxation schemes, and networks of patronage, creating the skeleton on which a new polity could be built. The campaign in Egypt demonstrated the interplay of military pressure and negotiated settlement. Alexandria, as a major prize, forced the invaders to balance hard pressure with incentives to maintain commerce. Inside the city, wealthy merchants held secret meetings with envoys in the dead of night, debating whether to accept terms. One such clandestine parley involved a leading grain merchant who argued, "Grain will perish if ports close, and Europe will turn to other supplies. Our interest is in trade continuity." Captain of the attackers answered, "If you open the harbor and recognize our authority, we will protect your fleets and guarantee safe passage." The merchant finally said, "Then write it down and provide hostages. We will risk the bargain." The result was a negotiated opening that preserved the city's economic function while transferring political sovereignty. The strategic calculation favored maintenance of economic flows over purely symbolic control. In rural Upper Egypt, the dynamics were different. Local elites feared loss of privilege and fought longer, forcing small-scale campaigns that combined punitive raids and offers of clemency. The conquerors used calibrated punishment to deter resistance but offered restoration of rights to those who cooperated quickly. Throughout these operations, several tactical and logistical processes recurred and deserved technical enumeration. First, the use of scouts and guides allowed forces to exploit local knowledge for route selection and surprise. Second, the establishment of mobile supply nodes made extended marches possible without central wagons. Third, the integration of defectors into intelligence and administration provided inside knowledge of garrison dispositions and tax registers. Each process typically required specialized personnel and time to implement. For example, setting up a supply node required identification of water wells, negotiation with local owners for use, and coordination with camel train operators, a process that often took 3 to 5 days but yielded operational range increases of 30%. Similarly, converting captured bureaucrats into functioning local administrators required oversight and incremental transfer of authority over several months, during which the conquerors maintained restrictive oversight to prevent embezzlement or sabotage. At approximately 1/3 of the way through this narrative, it is worth pausing to reflect on a crucial interpretive choice. Did tactical innovation alone decide battles, or did the exhaustion and internal division of the empires create an opening? The short answer is both. The conquerors exploited structural weakness with tactical creativity. Reactions among contemporary commanders varied widely. Some insisted it was the novelty of the mobile guard, others saw imperial collapse as decisive. We invite you to comment with your view on which factor mattered more, tactical innovation or structural exhaustion, by starting your comment with either tactic or structure. The debate will help shape future episodes where we examine competing theories in detail. Meanwhile, the narrative proceeds to show how the interplay of battlefield outcomes and pragmatic governance shaped the months that followed. As resistance evaporated in some regions and hardened in others, the new masters faced the task of creating stable provincial governance. They established provincial capitals with mixed military and civil administration, assigned commanders to oversee tax registers, and set up judicial procedures to adjudicate disputes. A pattern emerged. Where administrators preserved existing local judges and legal traditions, social disruption was minimal. Where they attempted wholesale replacement, resistance and banditry rose. The lesson was administrative subtlety. Practical steps included issuing protected status letters to merchants, maintaining irrigation works and repairing dikes to ensure the grain supply, and distributing small stipends to local leaders to secure loyalty. Fiscal, rather than extract maximum immediate tribute, officials often accepted lower regular payments to guarantee long-term stability. Key human stories give the greater arc its texture. One such story concerns a former provincial official who switched sides and used his knowledge of tax districts to negotiate autonomous status for his hometown. He argued that compliance would preserve the town and its bazaars, and he bartered lists of taxable estates in exchange for assurances that local landholders would retain usage rights. His action prevented a punitive expedition and saved many lives, but it also entrenched a new class of intermediaries who brokered between conquerors and local populations. Another personal thread concerns a cavalryman's family who, uprooted by raids, found refuge in a newly founded garrison town that later became a thriving market. These microhistories remind us that conquest reshaped everyday life as much as it reconstituted political geography. A series of climactic engagements sealed the fate of the Eastern theater. In one such battle, redrawn across rolling lowlands and marsh, the converging movements of multiple corps and the failure of an imperial reserve resulted in a collapse that rippled through command structures. The visual tableau included broken wagons, banners trailing in mud, and the desperate attempts of regiments to form squares that could not hold. Auditory detail included the thud of bodies, the clash of metal, and the cries of wounded men seeking water in canals already choked with debris. Tactical decisions in those moments hinged on whether to commit reserves fully or to preserve them for orderly retreat. The conquering commander, sensing the psychological tilt, ordered an all-out pursuit that prevented any orderly reformation. Dialogue in the aftermath contained remorse and calculation. A captured officer said, "We misjudged their reserves. We thought exhaustion would force retreat." The victor answered, "You fought well, but your supply chain was broken and your men fled their pay." This mixture of practical constraint and moral calculus characterized the final unraveling. The Egyptian theater closed more through negotiated capitulations than through total destruction. In many instances, local elites arranged terms that protected life and property in exchange for political submission and tax payments. The conquerors, for their part, institutionalized their hold by establishing new legal norms that adapted existing practice. They maintained land tax registers but introduced standardized tribute obligations and deployed small mobile forces to guarantee enforcement. The synthesis of conquest and governance created a new political reality, one that preserved many elements of the past while shifting ultimate authority to the newcomers. After the decisive years of campaign, consolidation and institution building followed. The new rulers founded towns that anchored their military and fiscal presence, reorganized taxation to be predictable and collected, and integrated local elites into a patronage network that anchored loyalty. Military garrisons became nuclei of urban life, craftsmen settled nearby, and markets reopened under new protection guarantees. The administrative transition was neither sudden nor uniform, but the overall pattern was one of adaptation that favored continuity of commerce and order over wholesale revolution. 1 month after the final capitulation, the immediate visible changes were pragmatic and localized. Grain markets reopened under supervised conditions, bridge and canal repairs resumed, and small garrisons established checkpoints on major roads. The sight in many towns was of cautious daily life resuming, with farmers returning to fields previously abandoned and merchants testing routes under the watchful eye of new patrols. Practical administrative notes included the reissue of local licenses and the appointment of interim tax collectors, who coordinated with established local notables. Socially, there was relief mixed with anxiety. Children played in streets recently scarred by conflict, and the rumor mill circulated both optimistic and fearful accounts of possible future extractions. The 1-month snapshot shows a society in recovery, not yet reconciled, but capable of routine. 3 months after the major political changes, patterns began to consolidate. Tax registers were being systematically updated. Local judiciaries resumed normal caseloads, and markets showed increased volume as traders rebuilt networks. The early months of conversion witnessed a steady increase in public order, as mobile garrisons suppressed opportunistic banditry and essential repairs revived the irrigated economy. Religious institutions that had been cautious about official change found ways to coexist under new policy frameworks, and conversion rates in urban centers rose slowly as patronage networks incorporated new elites. In some provinces, local leaders who had previously resisted now sought formal positions within the new administrations, negotiating terms that secured privileges and influence. The 3-month mark signaled a transition from emergency management to routine governance. 6 months later, structural shifts were evident. New towns had formally declared administrative functions, and fiscal calendars began to reflect predictable revenue flows. Trade routes east and west resumed, albeit with altered leadership structures and customs expectations. Socially, intermarriage and local alliances between newcomers and established families began to cement relationships that would have long-term implications for identity and political loyalty. The military footprint receded from immediate occupation zones to garrison towns and patrol lines, allowing space for civic life to reassert itself.
Economically, long-term investments in irrigation and caravan infrastructure suggested a confidence that the new order would endure. The 6-month snapshot reveals that the initial shock of conquest had given way to an emergent stability, where the instruments of governance were working in parallel with local practice. The legacy of these campaigns was complex. In the short term, they reorganized authority and revenue systems, and in the long term, they altered language of administration, patterns of settlement, and the map of power. The collapse of the Eastern Imperial Center opened space for new regional alignments, while in Egypt, the fusion of military and bureaucratic practice produced administrative innovation. Many of the tactics that had proven decisive were not unique inventions, but refinements and recombinations of existing practices tailored to specific operational contexts. Most important was the capacity of the conquerors to convert military advantage into institutional authority by using a mixture of negotiation,
selective force, and pragmatic governance. The transformation was not only territorial, but also social and economic, as networks of trade and patronage reoriented to the new centers of power. In sum, what began as a series of raids and mobile operations matured into a coherent program of conquest and governance that capitalized on local opportunities and imperial vulnerabilities. Military effectiveness derived from mobility, decentralized command, and intelligence networks. Political durability required administrative ingenuity, respect for existing institutions where useful, and the forging of new centers that linked military presence to fiscal and judicial authority. The story of these campaigns is thus a study in the conversion of military momentum into sustainable rule, and in how flexible tactics met brittle structures and reshaped everyday life. If this narrative shifted what you believed about the nature of conquest and consolidation, leave a comment identifying which moments surprised you most. If you value detailed reconstructions and balanced analysis, subscribe to follow future episodes where we will examine individual battles and administrative reforms in greater depth. History is made of decisions, logistics, and people, and this episode has tried to show how those elements combined to redraw a region. The final thought to carry forward is simple. Great changes rarely spring from single decisive acts alone. They emerge when adaptable practices meet opportunity. When commanders who can move fast meet empires that cannot, the map itself becomes negotiable.